All right, so The Magician's Nephew, Chapter 4, The Bell and the Hammer. So we're just coming off from last chapter, which was the wood between the worlds, which is where Digory and Polly were in this mysterious wood where they kind of begin to figure that each pool probably is going to take them to a completely different world. And then finally, they get ready to just pick one and jump in, see where they go. And the last chapter finished with the words, and they jumped. And then this chapter is going to be where they emerge in the mysterious wasteland world of Charn. I remember this transition point from back when I was a little kid and I read this book for the first time. This transition between the chapters here as they're going off into this completely unknown place and who knows what kind of place it's going to be. I just remember that anticipation you feel, this kind of rush and this thrill of kind of like, this could be anything. So anyway, so the kids, when they arrive, the first thing they notice is the strange reddish light. Then they notice the area, which is this open courtyard surrounded by ancient crumbling buildings. And then third, they notice the dark blue sky. And everything is dim and chilly and dark, and you speak in whispers without meaning to. And it's interesting how both in the previous chapter and in this chapter, we get descriptions of the light and the sky. Last chapter, it was the pleasant greenish light because it was coming through the green treetops. This time, in contrast, it's a, quote, a dull, rather red light, not at all cheerful, end quote, with no flicker. Last chapter, you couldn't see the sky proper, but just the great lush green treetops above you. This time it says, quote, the sky was extraordinarily dark, a blue that was almost black, end quote. Digory wonders if there's about to be a thunderstorm or an eclipse because of how it looks. So it kind of seems like, without meaning to, C.S. Lewis has kind of color-coded these worlds for us. We got the world of the green light, representing life and the slow growth of trees that don't die. And then we got the world of the red light, representing evil and the corruption and the slow death of the quiet, tired sun. Both forms of light accompany the slow, still existence of a quiet and expansive world, but one of them is slow and still as it grows out of and into life, in keeping with the never-ending will of its creator. The other is slow and still as it grows out of and into death, in tragic consummation of evil and age-tired expiration of the original good designs of the creator. And part of the reason I make this comparison between these two worlds is partly because the narrator actually kind of briefly suggests some kind of comparison like that, because after he describes the landscape and how it's the ancient and expansive ruins of what was once a great city, and how the stones kind of seem red, but maybe it's just the red light that makes them seem that way. And then the narrator observes that the feel of the place with its utter oppressive silence makes them feel frightened and uncomfortable. And then the narrator says, quote, this place was at least as quiet as the wood between the worlds, but it was a different kind of quietness. The silence of the wood had been rich and warm. You could almost hear the trees growing, rich and warm and full of life. This was a dead, cold, empty silence. You couldn't imagine anything growing in it. So I really love this concept. I think it's just so beautiful and fascinating how Lewis is comparing and contrasting these two different kind of inactive worlds, you could say. That's the green, this is the red. That one's alive, this one's dead. That one's as it is supposed to be, nature proceeding according to its design. This one's in rejection or defiance of what is supposed to be, nature proceeding against its design. And I suppose that you could say this can serve as a reminder for all of us that when we look at any real or fictional life, there's never just one kind of silence, one kind of inactivity. It's like there's never just one kind of sound or one kind of activity. And we can't equate experiences even when the surface description would be exactly the same in life, in real life. And so whatever you or somebody you know might be going through at some particular point, the answer to the pain, let's say, or to the felt needs, the answer can never be just to have more silence, or to have less silence, or to have more activity, or less activity, to have more people, to have fewer people. The answer can never just be, I need to have more solitude, or I need to have less solitude. because silence can be healing and life-giving, and silence can be oppressive and dreadful, just like light can be green and comforting, or it can be red and ominous and terrifying. Or, of course, it could be green and treacherous, like the Emerald Witch's enchanted green flame, or it can be red and glorious, like a deep, warm sunset. I think C.S. Lewis is basically pointing out, probably without realizing that he was doing so, but he's basically pointing out that the very same thing can be reverberating with life or it can be reverberating with death. And then just giving a merely superficial analysis without reference to meaning and significance could entirely miss the difference between despair and fulfillment, between existential misery and existential satisfaction and joy and peace. Anyway, so going on with the story. So as they walk around in this foreboding landscape, Polly wants to go home, but Diggory wants to stay. And as they briefly argue about that, he ends up accusing her of being too afraid to keep going. And she says, "Who's talking about being afraid?" As she lets go of his hand and pulls away. And then the conversation goes on, but they end up staying. But it's interesting to think about the roles of fear and ego in managing the decision-making direction and process of this particular, we could say, socially mediated joint decision that they make at this point in their friendship and at this point in their adventure. Because even though it's just a couple of lines here, it really stands out to me because it kind of takes me back to the interchange back in chapter 1 outside of Uncle Andrew's study. If you remember the bit where they're hesitating right outside the door in the tunnel passageway there, they're hesitating because they both feel the sudden weightiness of the moment and the significance of what they're about to do. And it's the social aspect of their interaction that ends up pushing them through that moment. This is the part where Polly says, "I'm game if you are." And then, motivated by one another, they push through the fear and they creak open the door. And so I think something psychologically similar is happening right here, except it's a whole lot less supportive and friendly and a whole lot more adversarial and destructive to their relationship. You could suggest that this micro conflict here in this chapter has begun to emerge partly because Polly's intuition of danger slash caution is much stronger now that they're in this new place. And Diggory's, on the other hand, Diggory's insatiable curiosity and thrill is also much stronger now that they're in this new place. So, because both of their intuitions or inclinations or felt needs are so much more powerful now and are beginning to overpower any other motivations or tendencies that they have here, so as a result, they take more radical interpersonal measures than they would ordinarily. They resort to more adversarial, particularly Diggory, resorts to more adversarial interactions to force the other person to align with your own goals, which is unfortunately a kind of normal way that humans end up interacting in real life and in fiction, of course. We could say the more internal pressure somebody feels, the more likely that person is going to be to forego healthy interactions and resort to relational chaos and disruption, as though those kinds of angry, jerking movements of desperation would fix things and make them better. And of course, the reason we do that is because in the short term, those kinds of things do allow you to force the relational dynamics into place to be what you want them to be. In the long term, on the other hand, you shoot yourself in the foot, you shoot the friendship in the foot, resulting in neither of you having what you want in the friendship, which is, broadly speaking, the kind of thing that results from most of the various kinds of uncontrolled impulses of anger or greed or self-will that we have churning within us. To use the language of the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, the actions of the sarx, or the flesh, or as the old NIV put it, the sinful nature. That is to say, the impulsive part of humanity that acts without regard for God's creation design or for the spiritual wisdom that God provides, but instead acts in these jerking movements of impulse to get what you want. Anyway, so after Diggory's jab at Polly for being afraid, they end up agreeing to continue for now. And so they go on, keeping on exploring as they go through these endless hallways and courtyards and great buildings and these massive ruins here. The narrator says, "Clearly, the place had been deserted for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. And there are no ants or spiders, there's no grass or moss, just stone ruins and dry earth." And I thought it was kind of a nice little touch how Polly's personality is further illustrated by the fact that she's the one who uses the throwaway line, That doesn't look very safe, as she points to a bulging wall that's about to collapse. Because at this point in the story, Digory and Polly, they're both practicing caution. For example, they both walk slowly across this large open area rather than running across it because they're practicing caution. But this one particular throwaway line is given to Polly rather than Digory because throughout the book, her personality and intuitions are consistently operating in a more cautious, careful, danger-aware sort of way than Digory's, which is part of what makes them such a good team. But of course, it's also what leads to their conflict and their eventual animosity toward each other. So, anyway, they finally come to the door to this room full of countless motionless human forms, ornately and colorfully dressed, wearing robes and crowns. And the narrator says, "The blaze of their colors made this room look not exactly cheerful, but at any rate rich and majestic after all the dust and emptiness of the other rooms." We also get a little more insight into Polly's personality when the narrator says, "This time Polly took the lead. There was something in this room which interested her more than it interested Digory. All the figures were wearing magnificent clothes." So once again, whereas Digory is drawn by thrill or curiosity or danger, Polly is drawn by beauty. In this case, perhaps we could add, there's also a human interest aspect because here it's not just color, but it's also these are the likenesses of people that she's being drawn into. But particularly the narrator specifies that she's interested in clothing. And this is similar, we could say, in terms of how it shows us the personality of Polly. We could say this is similar to how in chapter 1, Polly saw, remember that upstairs passage in her house? She saw that upstairs passage to be the perfect makings for a cozy smuggler's cave that she could create. So beauty, creativity, cultivation of things. Whereas Digory could only see, or primarily would see, the thrill and mystery of possibility for exploration and the unknown. So for him, it's curiosity and the pursuit of knowledge and thrill and things like that. And then, meanwhile, whereas this scene shows us Polly's kind of stereotypically feminine interest in clothing and things like that, it also gives us, on the other hand, a little more insight into Digory as well, because Digory is the one who, it seems, is more aware of dark magical things. Because Polly wonders out loud why the clothes haven't rotted away, and then it says, "Magic," whispered Digory. "Can't you feel it? I bet this whole room is just stiff with enchantments. I could feel it the moment we came in." What makes this stand out is because prior to this, we would probably generalize that pretty consistently Digory tends to be less aware or sensitive than Polly. But in this case, it seems, has a sensitivity that he feels quite in tune with, but Polly isn't. Now, you could suggest perhaps Polly is less aware of that feeling of the magic being in the air, maybe because she's distracted by the beauty and the clothing that she's focused on. Or, on the other hand, what I think may be to be more likely is that her sensitivity includes specifically certain feminine intuitions, whereas what Digory is feeling here is a quite different kind of sensitivity that he is more attuned to than Polly. Polly's intuitions and senses aren't so much attuned to the kinds of dark magical currents that Digory seems to be immediately aware of the moment he steps into the room. You could suggest perhaps this is connected to Digory being a relative of Uncle Andrew. Or on the other hand, you could suggest maybe it's connected with Digory's orientation to danger and thrill and the lust for power or knowledge. Or I think it's probably both. Both of those. Anyway, so in this room, if you walk down the aisle between the two columns of figures in this room, if you look at the faces, you notice a progression, which Lewis describes with 4 or 5 stages. He says at first the faces are kind and wise. Then you come to the ones that are solemn and look stern. And then you come to ones that look very strong and proud and happy, but cruel. Followed by ones that look crueler. And then you come to ones that were cruel, but no longer happy. Even despairing faces, as if the people they belonged to had done dreadful things and also suffered dreadful things. And then last of all, we could say category 6, if we want to think of it that way. The 6th description here in the progression is reserved for one person at the end of the line, which is going to be Queen Jadis, who is very tall, quote, "with a look of such fierceness and pride that it took your breath away." And then later on, they disagree about how beautiful she was. And then after that, there were also empty chairs after Queen Jadis, suggesting that there's room for plenty more to be added, but for some reason, no more were ever added. Anyway, so they end up going back outside that room to the outer room outside that room, and in the center of that larger room, there's this square pillar about 4 feet high, and on it there rose a little golden arch from which there hung a little golden bell, and beside this there lay a little golden hammer to hit the bell with. And I absolutely love this bit of poetry on the side of the pillar. Make your choice, adventurous stranger. Strike the bell and bide the danger, or wonder till it drives you mad what would have followed if you had. I love this part. It says, strike the bell and bide the danger, or wonder till it drives you mad what would have followed if you had. It's just this fun little bit here. And I think this is not supposed to be in this kind of seamless historiographical sense of trying to be this convincingly seamless in-universe kind of thing. But on the other hand, this is something Lewis put in as kind of a witty, fun-loving fairy tale plot device. This kind of mysterious and memorable succession of wit all piled into this little bit of fun-loving poetry. It's as though it was put there specifically for Digory. This was designed for Digory. And I guess you could say, well, I suppose it is now, isn't it? Because Lewis made this as the special temptation specifically made for Digory, which is part of what makes it so exquisite. But of course, that's from the outside perspective. This isn't in universe, at least from any way that I could think of. But of course, pretty quickly it becomes obvious what this isn't, that this definitely isn't some temptation designed specifically for Polly, because she immediately gives her kind of dismissive, out loud answer, no fear, we don't want any danger. But Digory, on the other hand, has been taken the moment he reads it. And then he proceeds to make excuses to try to manipulate Polly into going along with him. And when she won't cooperate, he ends up skipping the convincing stage and impulsively forcing the matter. And at that point, we are back to the Apostle Paul's sarx, the flesh, the sinful nature. The psychological impulse that Digory ends up following is not that different from the impulse behind his fear comment earlier in the chapter. The big difference is how far he's willing to go to force his will and take advantage of his friend now that we're at this point. And then that's going to be the part where he spitefully holds her down and strikes the bell. But we'll get to that in a minute. But before we get to that, let's back up a little bit. So the argument between them, it had really started to gain steam when they're basically just exchanging insults about you being so like a girl, you're so like a boy, which is just such a convincingly kind of fun real life way that Lewis has put in here of how these young kids kind of would go at each other. And it's kind of humorous when Digory mentions that all girls care about is gossip and rot about people getting engaged. I thought that was just so funny. Of course, it's not funny for the characters. They're really going at each other in a kind of angry, spiteful kind of way. But anyway, it's also interesting in that kind of angry argument between them. In between those parts, it's intriguing that Polly expresses that she thought Digory looked exactly like his uncle as he said something particularly spiteful. Now, definitely, while that whole conversation at that point had got to the point of being just this endless exchange of insults. So in that sense, we probably shouldn't necessarily take anything that either of them says too seriously or read too much into it. But at the same time, it certainly makes a lot of sense that she might have seen an echo of Uncle Andrew in the face of Digory at that moment, because you could think of this whole scene and this whole part of the story as pushing us toward that kind of idea. Digory is, at this point, kind of at a turning point in which his lust for knowledge and power, combined with his dismissive disinterest in the interests of other people, these kinds of things within him are drawing him toward the essence of the Uncle Andrew path. In a sense, we could think of him very naturally. We could think of him as being the true successor to his uncle. Kind of like how Uncle Andrew was the successor to Mrs. LeFay. The difference would be that if Digory replaced his uncle, in contrast to how Uncle Andrew replaced Mrs. LeFay, if Digory succeeded his uncle, it would have been more likely to involve him ending up killing and then replacing his uncle, rather than how it happened with Uncle Andrew, cooperating with and learning from Mrs. LeFay. But anyway, more to the point. The temptations that Digory faces are very similar to the kinds of lures that pulled and then ended up coming to lastingly define Uncle Andrew and make him who and what he was. Anyway, so after their argument has escalated, their argument about whether to strike the bell has so quickly and violently escalated into these personal insults and name calling and low blows, which include the part where Polly comments on how Digory sounded an awful lot like Uncle Andrew and looked like Uncle Andrew when he said what he said. And then finally, Polly says she is done and she's going to leave. And Digory sees her reaching for her pocket to teleport away. Now, this part here, when I was listening to this audiobook in preparation for this video, I found myself writing down in my notes. I wrote down, wow, I had forgot just how much Digory did in this moment here. Because he didn't just strike the bell. He held her down with his body, forcing her to stay and watch while he struck the bell with spite and defiance. It wasn't just about satisfying his curiosity. It was about subjugating her and forcing her to agree when she didn't, forcing the friendship to accompany him in his exploratory process. And then also, more importantly, forcing his will onto somebody else, trampling the selfhood of another human being. Man, this scene was worse than I remembered. And I think you could really say that at this point, Digory did pretty much become Uncle Andrew for that moment. Because at this point, he has just belittled her, because a minute earlier he'd said, I should never dream of calling a kid like you a woman, said Digory loftily. So he belittled her, just like that's the core of the Uncle Andrew path. And then shortly after that, he has dominated and abused her to satisfy his lust for knowledge and power, which is the exact essence of the Uncle Andrew path. The only thing that would be remaining to complete the path would be repetition and non-repentance, for Digory to repeat that kind of thing over and over again in an unrepentant, I value this and I want to keep doing it kind of way. So really, like, wow, this is such an important hinge point for the story. Anyway, so after he hits the bell, then the sound comes and it says it's a sweet sound, but as it grew, quote, the sweetness had something horrible about it. Almost like it's supposed to be symbolic for sin in general, how it's sweet and wonderful, but then it grows louder as it goes, and the very sweetness has something horrible about it. But anyway, so the sound grew louder, and then it transitions to where it's beginning to make this ancient building shake, and then a part of the roof caves in. And then the note stops and the smoke clears. And then the chapter ends with ominous foreshadowing when Polly says, There, I hope you're satisfied now. And then Digory says, Well, it's all over anyway. And then the narrator says, And both thought it was, but they had never been more mistaken in their lives. And the chapter ends. Oh, man. So a lot of heavy stuff. And it feels kind of like a short chapter, but it's exactly the same length as the other chapters, 11 Kindle double column screenfuls. Maybe it partly feels so short because the chapter ends before Jadis awakes, so then it ends up feeling like the chapter's not over yet. We're not done. But I think ending the chapter here maybe says a bit about Lewis's intention. Maybe it says a lot about Lewis's intention, because this isn't just a plot device for bringing Jadis in. Rather, this is the development and climax of the relationship conflict between our characters. That's what's really important here. The relationship conflict between our characters, as well as the development and expression of Digory's development. And this is the first fully explicit instantiation of the theme of temptation and the inner battle with the universal inner evil of humanity that Digory and each of us has teeming inside of us, the call to the Uncle Andrew path. Just like in Genesis 3 in the Bible, the desire to dominate is presented here as being central to fallen humanity and the fallenness inside Digory. And also, it's also intriguing within the concept of friendship. It's interesting that throughout this chapter, Digory's desire, Digory doesn't just want to have his fun or feed his curiosity, go and explore. He wants to have his fun with a friend. We as humans, no matter how much sin is filling up our soul, we humans have a longing and a desire to be socially connected and to do things together with people you care about. So, whereas, yes, sometimes sin leads to a preference to be alone, as suggested by Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, in which hell is symbolized as people moving further apart from each other forever until everybody's completely isolated. So, while, yes, sometimes sin leads to a preference to be alone, but prior to that particular sinful corruption of God's good, prior to that is this other sinful corruption of God's good, the impulse to force relationship to serve your purposes or your desires rather than the other person's purposes or desires. In other words, to make the relationship artificial. Artificial because when one individual is allowed and the other is not allowed to express individuality in the relationship, well, at that point, it's no longer interrelationship, but instead it's merely coercion or subjugation, which is not the same thing as a relationship at all. So in that sense, it's kind of a pretend relationship or an artificial relationship. And then where the isolation part would come in, as in the metaphor in The Great Divorce, that idea would be kind of like if all the Diggories and Pollys in the world have been trying to subjugate one another, but then ultimately they're going to find out that they can't and that that's not satisfying and it doesn't work in the end. So then in the end, when everybody's been experiencing the misery of perpetual anarchy, in the end, they sullenly retreat so as to no longer be abused by those who are stronger than them. And and that makes a lot of sense because artificial relationships and using one another can never actually go on and provide what we as humans need in the ways that matter the most. It can only result in the long term, in the big picture, it can only result in what the Bible refers to as death. So, anyway, when Digory and Polly argue early on about whether to continue to explore Charn, and then Digory manipulates her by calling her afraid, and then later on in the chapter, when they're arguing about the bell, and Digory is going to maliciously force her to watch him strike it, those scenes are actually, they're not just showing us temptation and the impulses of the sarks playing out in oppressive and destructive ways. They're definitely doing that, but they're also showing us a little glimmer of an echo of the goodness of the social design of humankind. They're showing us a little echo of the fact that we, as humans, long to do life together. Whether we are Digory or Polly, we don't just want to be allowed to explore Charn or to create a smuggler's cave in our attic or to find a really good fun book to read. We want to share whatever these good things are that we find. We want to share them with others. We want to share the experience. And then we could say, big picture, if a Digory or a Polly is going to find a life that is the way life is supposed to be, that's probably going to have to mean that perhaps with the help of the wisdom of Aslan, let's say, but it's going to have to mean something like learning how to feed that good desire inside us that has been put there by God, while stamping out this parallel poisonous desire that is growing in parallel with the good desire, growing like cancer on the underbelly of our souls. In that path of learning how to feed and follow the good desire, the needs put there by God, while stamping out the parallel poisonous desire, that's the path of true friendship, true joy, true life. That's, as it were, that's the song that Aslan is going to be singing into the dark to give birth to the joys of Narnia. That's the song Aslan sings that brings life. And that path, true friendship, true joy, true life, that path is life that is truly life, in contrast over against the death and decay of the dull red ruins of Charn. Anyway, so that's it for chapter 4. Next up, we're going to get chapter 5, where Queen Jadis comes onto the scene and bad things get worse. So I look forward to being able to talk about and explore the ideas presented in that chapter. Now, if you want to be notified when my next video comes out, make sure you hit the subscribe button and tap the bell icon. This is a channel where we discuss science fiction and fantasy in light of stuff like psychology, philosophy, and spirituality. So I got a variety of different things on the channel. This series here, Pondering Narnia, is one of the things that I'm trying to be consistent at, putting out content relatively regularly on my channel. But anyway, thanks for watching, and I will maybe see you in the next one. Have a good day.